Protecting human rights and demanding justice from our federal government has never been more important. But this year, we wanted to take a look closer to home. We know that our neighbors here are being targeted by federal policies, and we condemn that absolutely. But we also want to talk about how our local government is acting on their obligation to protect human rights. The city of Seattle declared itself a human rights city in 2012, and as you just heard, has also issued a proclamation acknowledging the 70th anniversary of the International Declaration of Human Rights. And we appreciate that, and we know that it's important to continue to acknowledge that. But tonight we want to talk with people about what our own city is doing to protect human rights and human rights defenders right here in Seattle. When our city spends tens of millions of dollars to move homeless people from one side of the street to the other, when we rehire a police officer who has been fired for unconstitutional policing, when we aren't protecting transgender people in our city, what is that really saying to our community about what Seattle wants to do to protect human rights? It's not just explicit human rights abuses that we have to consider. We also need to think about how our local policies and practices impact our neighbors, especially those whose intersectionality could make them more vulnerable. How are we protecting disabled people of color? What is in place to protect people of color who suffer from mental illness? And do our policies support or dismantle the structural oppression in our city? These are important questions for us to consider, and the answers have real impacts on real people. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Tonight's event will be a moderated panel discussion focusing on the intersectionality of human rights in Seattle. So I'm going to invite our panelists to come and take a seat on stage. And I want to remind our audience members, you should have index cards. If you have questions that occur to you during the panel discussion, please write them down. We're going to save about 15 minutes at the end to hear your questions and to try to get as many of your questions into our discussion tonight as possible. And I'm going to hand it over to Aaron to moderate.
Hello again. Allan has already been introduced, so I will go on to the other panelists that are up there. Start with Katrina Johnson. She is a social justice advocate and activist. She helped pass the Initiative 940, which went into effect today. She advocates nationally for families who have lost their loved ones to deadly use of force by law enforcement. Next is Alisa Bernard. She is the Director of Education and Partnership at OPS. She works on advocacy and collaboration nationally as a survivor of prostitution and mentors other survivors to amplify their voices. And lastly, we have Monserrat Padilla. Monserrat has been organizing LGBTQ, immigrant, and communities of color on the ground for over 10 years to build collective movement power. She was a co-founder of the Washington Dream Coalition and has led national and statewide campaigns, including the victory on the Washington State Dream Act to expand eligibility for state aid in higher education. She's worked as the national program coordinator for the Queer Undocumented Immigrant Project, a program of United We Dream, where she worked across the country building a national network of LGBTQ immigrant community leaders. She advocates and organizes to develop policies and advocate addressing the needs of LGBTQ immigrant communities. So we're gonna kind of have this be a discussion, but more of a conversation between you guys, if that's possible. There are microphones if you wanna go back and forth between these two. Who would like to start?
Y'all looking at me. So You know, when I was asked to speak on this panel, I was asked how my work with the Organization for Prostitution Survivors intersects with human rights. And I've had a really long day today that said a lot about intersection. And quite frankly, I can't think of an issue that intersects with human rights quite as much as commercial sexual exploitation. Because I'm going to be very honest with you, most people in prostitution and commercial sexual exploitation trafficking, they don't look like me. They are not typical, average, this considered, you know, whitewashed image that I truly am. Because if you're not sighted, by the way, I'm very white. So most people in prostitution don't look like me. This is an issue that truly intersects poverty, it intersects marginalization, it intersects racism. This is a huge problem in our city, mainly because we need to look at not only who is being bought, but who is doing the buying. And quite frankly, when I do my job, what I see is a lot of women and girls of color, a lot of women and girls who are traditionally from marginalized backgrounds in poverty, and homelessness, people with chemical dependency issues, people that identify differently than what you would expect everyone else to identify as, which is not a problem. I'm going to repeat that. That is not a problem. We need to acknowledge that the people that are buying sex in our city are predominantly white men. They're predominantly white, educated, very well educated actually, men that are getting paid a lot more than the rest of us, truthfully. So we need to acknowledge that this is a problem where we have a privileged group buying an underprivileged group, and we can no longer sit by and condone and condemn a certain class of our women and girls predominantly to being a commodity and a sexualized object. So I really don't know where I'm going with this other than just it's been a really long day, because this morning I heard that there was a sentencing of a white man who was a sex buyer and later turned into a trafficker, and he got 43 months. 43 months in prison for this. And earlier this week there was a girl who was pled guilty to killing her trafficker only about a week out of her 16th birthday, and I don't even know what her sentence is going to be, but I am assuming it's going to be way more than 43 months. So until we can address that, I'm going to continue doing this work in Seattle, and I'm going to continue doing this work nationwide. So I think I've said my piece for the moment, and I'll hand this over to Katrina.
It's been a long day. So how my work intersects with human rights is I'm a social justice activist. I became an activist after my cousin, Charlena Lyles, was killed by law enforcement last year. So I became an activist by default. And basically, human rights is the right of being just simply human. And oftentimes, black and brown people aren't seen as being human. They are less than. And for that mere fact, I advocate on behalf of families within the city, within the state, nationally and internationally, on police reform and accountability measures, so that people start looking at us as not less than, but we are the same. We are all human. It doesn't matter whether you are black, white, Native American, or whatever. We are all human, and until we start seeing one another as human beings, then we have a long way to go.
Thank you.
So I think for me, beyond my personal life and how it has been intersectional, and having to experience the challenges of not being given full human rights, my particular work, I work with the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, which today is the front line of deportation defense when ICE comes knocking at the door. And I would say that the fear that our communities have faced, immigrant communities have faced, is not new under this administration, However, under this administration, the militarization, the exacerbation of using force and power to remove forcefully communities and remove parents from their children is something that we are seeing day in, day after day. So I think for me and how this work intersects with broader communities, you know, for folks that don't know, LGBTQ folks, when they're detained in immigration detention, they're 15 times more likely to be sexually assaulted by an own official correction officer, an immigration detention officer. And just recently, we have Roxana Hernandez, who was found dead in an immigration detention center, and not just dead by medical conditions, she suffered, she had a chronic illness, she had HIV, but before her death, an autopsy just came out where she was beaten to death. So that just tells you a little bit about what's happening today in America's detention system. And for folks who have turned on the news, you know, seeing flying bullets, rubber bullets hitting children, and tear gas hitting mothers trying to cover their children just a week ago is something that, again, is not something that came out this week. It's been happening in this country because of imperialism, because of capitalism. So as we move forward and we talk about human rights, we need to start talking about the root cause of why we have disparities in this world and why we have injustices in this country. So,
Thank you.
As you heard, I work with the mentally ill, and a large part of my job is to try and make them have normal lives within the community, take them out shopping, take them out banking to do their banking transactions and stuff like that. Now, the stigma associated with the mentally ill basically takes away your identity because somebody else ascribes to you an identity that is not wholly yours. While working with this community, I have come to realize that these are whole people with their own identity. They have things that they are excited about, they have things that they love, they have things that they despise, just like me. Hey, do you like a latte? No, you know. And it's so amazing, you know. Yet, a lot of us would want to ascribe to them an identity that is not theirs, you know. They just can't manage their life or handle their lives. And this has been a very rich and rewarding experience for me. And how it intersects with my experience as an immigrant and with the racism and xenophobia is that mentally ill people, I mean, when you're mentally ill, it doesn't discriminate. I have to work with white patients, I have to work with black patients, I have to work with Latinas, you know, you name it, you know? And I have to weave my way through this cultural mosaic that has been built. And it intersects right there. And it really is wrong for us to take people's identities away. I'm a social psychology student, and a large part of my studies has been focusing on stereotypes. The thing about stereotypes, as Chimamanda Adichie says, is it's not, they're not, I mean, they're true, you know, but they give you a different story, you know. It's not the whole story. Am I black? Yes, that's a stereotype. But is that my entirety of me? No. But the problem is that when you take me out of this safe space over here, I become somebody's stereotype. I'm a black male, and God knows the responsibility that goes with that title. So that's how my work and the whole intersectionality thing comes into play.
Thank you. So you guys just chime in if you are moved to. First question is, what is something the city of Seattle is doing well to support you and your community?
So something that with the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network we have worked on this year just recently there was a report from the UW Human Rights Society. No, is it? Okay, I can't remember the institution, but it's somewhere in the UW. And it talked about where are most of the deportations happening in the state. Do you folks think here that Eastern Washington is the highest place where deportations are happening? Raise your hand. Do folks think that overall Western Washington, I would say like overall, is where most deportations are happening? Yeah. And the report, it says King County is actually where the highest number of deportations are happening still today. So when we talk about this progressive bubble that we've created, it has not transitioned into safety nets for our communities. So I think that's important to highlight, right? You know, as a couple months ago, we've heard that ICE was in Columbia City and it became chaos for all of us. We're like, how did that happen in our progressive bubble in Columbia City where we are so ready to fight back, right? But it's still happening. ICE is coming and doing a lot of individual pickups. But something that the city has, the government, the county and the city has done well is that they have been working closely with advocates. Prior, the number one way that deportations would happen in the county and in the city was that people would be handed over to ICE by local law enforcement. Now, that doesn't mean that it's still not happening. Not that long ago, we heard that the Tequila Police Department had an incident where an individual called the police because their car was broken into, and that police officer called ICE on them, and then was handed over to Immigration Custom Enforcement, and it ended up in Tacoma Detention Center. So that also means that policy doesn't do it all. It's really a change of culture that we're working against. And because of those results, we were able to push forward a King County model, national model ordinance where not only are we prohibiting local collaboration between local law enforcement and ICE and any agency of the county, but also ensuring that there is a legal defense fund moving forward for these communities if they were to end up in the hands of ICE, where they will get legal representation, and also the services that they need in the language that they need it. Ensuring that local agencies have to provide that language access need for them. So, I mean, I think that there's still a lot more work to be done because it's not just about a defense strategy, it's about changing a culture where we're welcoming and inclusive. And I foresee us moving into a non-citizen voting rights where our neighbor who has been paying their taxes can vote for the leaders that best represent them, so.
Thank you.
So how is our city, what was the question?
What is our city doing well to support you and your community?
So the one thing that I would say that the city did was the mayor and the city council unanimously signed on to endorse Initiative 940. But also the week after 940 passed, they signed on to the new SPOG contract, which rolled back accountability measures for communities. So it's hard to say, what are they really doing good?
I mean, that kind of segues into the next question, which is what the city of Seattle could be doing better.
I would say what they could do is not confuse the citizens, the community. 70% of King County voted for Initiative 940, which meant that they wanted change, that something was being done wrong when 42 people in the state are dying at the hands of law enforcement. We are fifth in the nation in police use of deadly force. So to endorse Initiative 940 for de-escalation and, you know, accountability, but in the next breath, roll back accountability measures for members in the community who are already marginalized and are already dealing with implicit bias is absurd. So what are you actually saying to us? Do you care about us, or are you just saving face and signing on to something because it was the right thing to do because it was going to pass regardless? So that's kind of where I'm at.
Same question to anybody else.
What's it doing well or poorly? I mean, which one? 'Cause
What
I
the
can give
city
you all
could
sorts
be
of-
doing better.
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that the city and King County can be doing better, specifically around my issue, is starting to understand that when you're, and I think they're kind of getting there because of the quashing the warrants. Last week there was a big ol' announcement that they were going to be quashing about 208 warrants for numerous different things like prostitution charges and things like that. But one of the things I'm seeing an increase on specifically right now, because it's getting cold outside and people are getting really, really desperate to get off the streets, is to start acknowledging that there are a lot of fringe crimes that come around with commercial sexual exploitation. I mean, and Mayor Durkin said it herself, these are crimes of poverty. Like when you are so desperate to get the heck off the street that you go steal a sweater and then go steal another sweater and then go steal another sweater in hopes that you'll spend a night in jail, that's not a solution. I think that we need to be putting far more effort into not just prevention work, but also just acknowledging that like there are women and girls, there are people of all genders still out there, and we need to figure out ways that we can do both harm reduction work and exit services for all of these problems. Because, you know, the reality is I mean, we've worked really hard in Seattle to start acknowledging specifically commercial sexual exploitation as a gender-based violence crime, which is great. But like if you look nationally, if we're not pairing legislation to reduce that with legislation that helps women and girls get out, or helps women and girls find a safe place to stay, or helps them get away from their pimps, or get education services or mental health services or chemical dependency, that one specifically, a few more of those beds would be great. I think that like it just doesn't do anything. So I mean, I get concerned that we're trying to prevent the problem, but we're not really addressing the problems that we already have.
If I could jump in there, there is a serious problem of the stopgap between in the mental health sector. There needs to be like, if we could have like more crisis units, because sometimes people commit those crimes of poverty that you're talking about, and they're probably a little bit mentally ill. Whereas this person would be better served going into a crisis center where they could be stabilized and put back out in the community, instead of the system where we just have it, okay, you have offended, you're going straight to jail. And we know what happens when you go to jail. That basically leads to a downward spiral.
Well, the reality of the situation is if the person that is having a mental health crisis even makes it to jail. My cousin was in the middle of a mental health crisis last year, and she was shot down 7 bullets, 2 in the back. So are these people actually making it to jail or to a place where they can get help? No, oftentimes, and more than likely, people with mental health crisis are being killed by law enforcement at a higher rate than anyone else.
So what would you say the cost to our society is if we deny people their human rights?
What is, I mean, I almost call, what kind of question is that? I mean, what are the costs? I mean, the cost is everything. I mean, it's our future, it's our generations to come, it's us right now, it's the fact that we continue this system of capitalism where we keep stepping on each other to get ahead. It's the commodification of our women and girls. It's the continued cycle of poverty that many, many people in Seattle are stuck in. It is all of these, like I didn't even want to take the microphone because I was like, oh my gosh, I mean, that's everything. Like to deny human rights is to deny like your personhood. And like, to be objectified down to that sort of a commodity is the ultimate dehumanization. That is how violence happens. You have to objectify to create violence, and that creates violence.
I can tell you the current cost. The current cost is 1,500 people right now in the Tacoma Detention Center, right now. And that's just the Tacoma Detention Center. Unfortunately, under this administration, we're building mini detention centers in other counties, including the Yakima County, Okanagan County is in discussions of that. Snohomish County has that discussions of an MOU building a portable, in a way, or a temporary detention center. So not only do we have the Tacoma Detention filled up to capacity, and the SeaTac Federal Prison was there for a minute. I don't know if folks here went for the Families Belong Together action. But that was temporarily. There was 207 people there, and now we're filling up other county jails with people in there. What that also means is that we have kids in Tornillo, Texas, a migrant children detention center. Right now, there's around 7,000 migrant children, and it actually was supposed to be ending relatively soon. That detention center was supposed to be closed down. The contract was renovated until 2020. So that children detention center has no intentions of going or leaving anytime soon. So that is the current cost that we're paying because we're actually still not respecting human rights.
I don't even know where to go with that one. To deny somebody's humanity is to deny them to the right to exist. And that is what those rights grant us. And that's the problem with stuff like racism, you know. I'll speak from personal experience, where I started speaking out instead of just keeping quiet and taking the microaggressions as they come every day. Somebody who should have been my protector, somebody who should have been a mentor to me, I had them at a really vile racist thing about me, and I was out, they thought I was out of earshot, or they really didn't see me. And that kind of unscrambled my brains like completely, because I'd come to trust this person. And that kind of changed my perspective completely on this whole issue. So when you racially profile somebody, racially stereotype them, you're saying this is a person other than me. This is a person lesser than me. And once that happens, you are denying them their humanity. You are giving yourself the right to abuse them in any way you wish. You're giving yourself the right to, you know, you can get away with anything so long as you've completely convinced a large population that XYZ population is an other. You can basically get away with anything that you do to that XYZ population. And that's the problem. If you deny people human rights right there, you are going to dehumanize another population and give people the opportunity to do as they will with them.
The cost is lives. There is blood spilled in the streets and homes and families left to pick up the pieces, who are forever traumatized, who will never be the same again. That's the cost.
What action can the people in the audience take tomorrow or even in the next week to support your causes?
So I came prepared. We actually have a couple flyers out in the back. It's what to do if ICE comes knocking at your door. Now I know that maybe some folks here in the audience have no particular need for it, but you right now are the voice for people who are afraid to go and ask for that. So my number one request today is for you to take a picture and put it on Facebook so that this number gets out into the community. And what this number does is that a community member sees this and ICE comes knocking at the door, they can call us, and we will have teams ready to go and start documenting ICE with the goal of protecting that person's rights and then connecting them to resources. The second thing that you can be doing is that under this current political time, there's way more people inside detention centers. And we just, as the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, launched a immigration bond fund for the entire state. Oftentimes, folks end up in the Tacoma Detention Center, and they get given a bond fund similar to a bail bond, but it's a completely different system. A judge often doesn't give it, and when they do today, they're having $15,000, $30,000 bond funds for these folks who, people are not making $30,000 on an annual year, less alone to be released. So people are having to stay inside detention centers because, for the simple matter that they're poor. So we've created a bond fund. So the second recommendation will be have a cocktail fundraising party so you can benefit this bond fund. And this bond fund will go back into the community so that we get as many people out of detention centers.
I would say that what people can do, what all of you could do, is to first realize that it could happen to any of you. What happened to me and what happened to my cousin last year is not an isolated case. And it doesn't matter whether you're black or white. The fact that indigenous people are killed at a higher rate than even black people is ridiculous. So what you can do is not turn a blind eye to what is happening and get involved within your communities, because the reality of the situation is it may not be at your doorstep today, but unless we change something, it could be you tomorrow. So don't make it seem like this can never happen to you. I met with a family from Stanwood last week. They never thought it was gonna happen to them. It can happen to anybody. So everybody has to realize that.
Is anything off limits? Well, I would say there's a number of things that can be done right now. I want to say the most basic thing that we all can do is teach our young girls in our life to become empowered women, to teach the young boys in our life to become good men. I think those are like the two most simple things that anyone can do to start stemming these problems. I think there's a number of things I would like to see. OPS, my organization, does a lot of work with women and girls in the community who just need help, and they need just crisis help. I think we did quite a large amount last month of what we call DCA, which is direct client assistance. That is something that's always needed. This is to help girls get away from their pimps. It's to help girls get away from their traffickers. It's to help girls apply for jobs or whatever they may need at that moment. We did a lot of work getting women and girls either into housing or things like that. What I would really love to see is more community partners coming to my organization and saying, hey, I provide this service, I really want to help you. Like, I need to call like 15 moving companies in the next couple of weeks and be like, hey, we got a lot of women that are either moving in or out of shelters, and what am I supposed to do with this? I can't get a U-Haul. We got a fundraiser coming up in February. There's a thing. I agree with the cocktail party. I think that's a very good idea. Little Major Jonah outreach right there. That was nice. I would also kind of work to destigmatize this. And I'm not just saying destigmatize prostitution, because I believe that prostitution itself should be stigmatized. This is not a positive thing. But to put that stigma where it belongs, which is not on the women and girls within it. And I say women and girls very intentionally because it is mostly women and girls in it. But to move that to the correct party, the people that are doing the exploitation, the traffickers, the pimps, the sex buyers, because they're fueling the market. So there's a lot that I think that you guys can do just by getting onto Facebook and having conversations with your friends about this. Because this is not an easy topic to have a conversation about. Human rights are not easy conversation topics at all. My 12-year-old niece brought it up to me the other day, and I was just like, yeah, we'll explain what Auntie does in a year or two. But honestly, I need to have that conversation with her now.
Thank you.
I wanted to say one more thing, because this is the funny thing how intersectionality works is that your urgent need comes first, right? And my urgent need as a trans Latina who's undocumented is, I don't want to end up in the detention center. And then my transness comes in after, where it is who I am, and it's after my urgent needs are met, I get to be me, right? So in terms of that, I think for trans communities is hire trans communities, pay trans communities, respect trans communities, and empower trans communities. So that's what I would say.
Well, I would say, as somebody who's studying social psychology, you've actually taken the first step to doing something, just being here, listening to our stories. Taking the first step is usually the most important thing that matters. The next thing is communicate, talk, across differences even. We have become a society that we want to live in our bubble so hard, we don't want to get out of our bubble and talk to somebody across the aisle. They're no different from us. Talking helps. We may not agree, but it helps humanize each other. If we don't talk, if we just keep screaming across at each other, we are going to end up dehumanizing each other, and that's what happens when we go back and forth, back and forth. So talking helps.
Not Seattle's strong suit. But as a society, specifically in the city of Seattle, what benefit could it have if we embolden access to human rights? What benefit would our society have if we began to embolden human rights?
That kind of segues into what I was talking to just now. It's the dehumanization factor when we're talking across at each other rather than listening to each other, we start dehumanizing each other. And the minute we start dehumanizing each other, society starts to slide into this cycle where we start stereotyping each other. And once you start stereotyping each other, you dehumanize each other, and therefore you give yourself the permission, you justify the action that you're taking against this person that, you know, you've dehumanized. So emboldening human rights is not only necessary, it is a must if we're to complete this journey of humanity, so that we can all look at each other as humans at the end of the day.
I'm going to share a story that I had in Eastern Washington, and I first want to introduce my coworker, Brenda Rodriguez, if you can stand up. She is the amazing organizer who's on the ground in the Eastern Washington, and when families are getting picked up, she's the one that responds to the calls. So the story that I want to share is one of being in a bar in Spokane. And me and Brenda were out after a long day of work, went and had a seat and had a beer. And right next to us was this white guy, who all of a sudden we just started talking, and we end up hearing that he was somebody who had gone to the border, held a rifle so that illegal entries wouldn't come in. And we were having a great time because all three of us were drinking a beer. And I think if we had our city emboldened in human rights, we could all just enjoy our beer. And I think that that's the beauty of that. Like, why can't we see our humanity when we're right next to each other, when we're doing what at that moment we're enjoying the most, which is at that point was drinking, having a drink, right? And being able to just have each other's presence. And then because for him, he just couldn't understand our humanity, but he could understand that we were enjoying a great beer, and by that made the connection to our humanity. But I don't think that we should wait till a beer to have our humanity be identified. So I think that that's what, that would be the difference in our city, that we would be able to fully, truly enjoy each other's presence because of the things that connects us to and the things that every day we do. So,
thank you. What questions did I not ask that I should have?
I would say let the audience, they might have, some
I think they're getting that
questions.
together right now to be up in a second.
So your question about this whole like what happens like when we lean into human rights, as it were. I mean, I'm always harkened back to that concept of like, wouldn't our economy be so much better if like all of us were participating in it? In this sense of like, I mean, instead of marginalizing more than half of our population to this concept of what human rights is not, if we were, instead of dehumanizing but actually embracing that full capacity and giving equal rights to education and employment opportunities and job skills training and all these things, I mean, wouldn't we just be a healthier society overall? I mean, think about what we could accomplish if all of us actually got to lean into that concept. That's all the time I got to waste. Sorry, I can see her walking up. I'm like, come on.
Ooh, if you're comfortable, would you like to share something that fuels your why? Like, why do you do this work? Because when you think of your why, generally it brings light to your eyes and stirs the fire in your belly. And sometimes we all need a reminder.
I do this so that my cousin's death will not be in vain. I also do this because I have a 17-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter, and I want them to be alive. I want them to come home. I cringe every day because I have a 6'4", 230-pound boy who's a baby to me, but he looks like a grown man to law enforcement. And the reality of the matter is I have to have a conversation with him on what he has to do to be able to get home every day safely. So I do this so that he can live and live life fully. That's why I do what I do.
I'll share my why of today. Early this morning, well, yesterday, we received a call to our hotline, which, again, if you share that number, we'll be able to receive more of these calls, of a company who was audited. And you have people who have been working there for decades. This morning, we went and met with some of those people who ICE now has their information and are at risk of deportation. And we had this older lady who was around 70 years old who has been working in this company for 20 years and begins to cry and says, I don't want to get deported, but I don't know where I'm going to go work next. How do I get a job now at this age? I've been working for this company for 20 years. And my why was being able to answer some of her fears and let her know that this time she's not alone, that oftentimes our community is alone when that comes up. But that this time, we were lucky to be able to be connected to her and that we won't let her go by herself and that we would answer her questions. So luckily the union that she was part of answered that question right away and told her that we have a lot of many more other companies that they have union contracts with and that they were gonna try to find her a job. So she left from that meeting with peace and at least clear steps of what to do next. So that was my why of today. And I think we need to be able to find every single day a why so that we feel the power that we need to continue fighting.
I've always, before I started speaking out, I was always comfortable with not taking the leading role, letting somebody else do stuff for me that I should actually be doing by myself. A weird dichotomy, that is. Until what I mentioned earlier, until I heard somebody who was supposed to be my mentor racially profile me in a less than savory manner, that changed my whole perspective. If this person would be thinking such ill thoughts about me, and putting them out there, you know. It changed a whole lot in of my perspective. I just felt like nobody should have to live their life in naivety about race and racism and the stigma that it has in society and how we racially profile people, stereotypes. I felt that we should just stop living in this naive world where we live that, oh yeah, we're okay, we're all friends and everything. It's just the knowledge that this world, it's a complicated world and we have to accept the complexity that we live in. And we need to be able to look at each other in the eyes with truth. The bottom line, if you're my friend, you're my friend. If you're my ally, you're my ally. Don't let me turn the corner and racially profile me. If that's what you think of me, then God knows what you think of somebody who's not close to you. And that's where the justification starts, because that person could easily take out a gun and shoot that other guy. And that's what I talk about, dehumanization. If he could stereotype me, then it goes therefore that he would have no feelings about the other person. And that there was my turning point. It was just like, you know, we got to speak the truth about race and racism and stereotypes, and let's figure this out.
I think my why is a little bit twofold. My why is deeply personal because I went through this and I remember it very vividly, and violence was my experience. And I do not want that for any other person, period. I will fight for this until the day I die. However, my why is also the fact that, you know, I kind of look at this and I think, another survivor once said to me, you know, people always talk about being the voices for the voiceless, but it's not that I ever felt I didn't have a voice. I did feel like I wasn't heard. And that's my why, is until we're all heard, I'm gonna keep doing this. And so it might not be that kind of like, you know, I had this beautiful thing happen to me. It's more of just like, I believe everyone deserves a voice.
I'm going to move on to the next question from the audience. How can we increase positive human interaction between groups in an age of digital-based connection?
More of this.
Yeah. You know, I really feel like we've lost that. Yes, more of this. I mean, like, in a short, I would say that, like, just having a face-to-face conversation with somebody is not something we do. I mean, I think I had like a 45-minute text conversation with my mother the other day, which was like half emojis and half typos that were extremely awkward. And finally I just called her and I'm like, exactly what are you asking me? She said, well, I want you to watch the dog. I'm like, okay, what? Really? Then what was the eggplant emoji? I'm not understanding. So I think that we have really gotten to this point where we almost dissociate ourselves when it comes to social media, when it comes to a lot of these things. We portray ourselves as something we are not online. The person I am when I do the media for ops is definitely not who I am. It's an extension of my personality, but it's not my whole personality. I definitely don't talk with that many emojis or hashtags, even though that does seem to be a thing now. So I think just like, you're right, more of this, more communicating, more talking, more sitting down and just having a beer.
I think yes to all of that, but because there's still that, you know, challenge, I think we can't not put a blind eye when uncomfortable conversations do happen on social media. And when it's your very close friends and you're a white person who's advocating for immigrants, and then your white friend comments, and then you want to play the devil's advocate or wants to lean, okay, or feel uncomfortable on putting that person in their place, right? Or at least being able to truly articulate the real meaning. So I say both because definitely social media facilitates faster conversations, or at least an open dialogue, because that is your platform, that is your world. And if your world has been poisoned by what we call racism, then it is your job to try to heal it, right? It is your job to try to make it a better world for your own local community. So don't shy away from a difficult conversation. Especially don't shy away if that conversation is something that you hold privilege in, because that is your responsibility as an ally to the people who don't have that privilege.
I think I'd add to that and just say that it's not always about calling people out as it is calling people in to a more full way of living, a more full version of a conversation. So yeah, definitely agree with you.
I think we might have time for one more question. Regarding the 940 initiative, what more can be done to address police brutality?
I would probably have to say 940 just got us up to standard with the rest of the states, but we have a long way to go, because 940 is really when deadly force is used. But what happens if they beat the hell out of you? You know what I mean? Then that SPOG contract, if you live in King County, then that comes into play. And all of those protections for us were rolled back. So really knowing what is going on within your community and things that affect you in your community so that you can teach other people. Those are ways to combat police brutality, and also speaking up. I mean, you don't have to be black. They beat the hell out of white people too. So it doesn't matter. It's not a respecter of persons. You know what I mean? It doesn't, just because it isn't happening to you right now doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's really good versus evil, right versus what's wrong. And the more we call it out and stop turning a blind eye to it, the more that we can actually come together and stop it. And actually pushing for your prosecutors to stop letting these individuals off for hurting other people. They are there to protect and serve people within that community. And those people in those communities are dying. That's a problem.
I'm going to share it with the lens of an immigration perspective and our enforcement body, which is Immigration Custom Enforcement, also known as ICE. We're ready to abolish ICE. Our movement has been ready. There's an agency that has millions of dollars that started 2003, and the concept of abolishing an ineffective agency is as if we're talking about abolishing the police, which hopefully will one day get there. But today, I'm ready to abolish ICE, and I think our immigrant communities are ready, and hopefully you are ready for that too. And if you feel that you need more insights and more reasonings and more numbers for that, we're happy to provide those.
Any final thoughts?
I just think that it's upon everyone to actually do their due diligence in seeing everyone else as human beings. Just because I understand that you might not want something in your community or homeless people in your community, but they are people. Until you start seeing people as people, we have a problem. When you want that person who might be, a sex worker off of your block, that's still a person. That's still somebody that is deserving of love, no matter what her circumstance is or his circumstance. And I think that, because people don't just disappear because they're not on your block, that just means they're on someone else's. So what can you do to actually help?
A teacher of mine once took me through what it means to go to a new country, a new place, experience a totally new culture. And He told me it's probably one of the hardest things you have to do. He's a psychology professor. Because what happens is you have to rewire your entire brain, starting from the way you speak. I never used to speak like this. My sister right there will tell you, I never used to speak like this. From what you eat, how you dress, how you walk, how you talk to other people. You have to rewire your whole brain. And any psychologist will tell you, rewiring your brain is the toughest thing you have to do. You think about any habit that you need to break. That latte you take in the morning, that's really hard to break, huh? So I bring that up because when you see immigrants, we really try and fit in the community. And we'd like just to be considered as human, just as the way you are.
Thank you all for being with us tonight. Give it back to Tammy.
Well, let's give our panelists another hand, please. This was amazing. Thank you all for sharing your stories with us. It's really been an honor to be here and to share your grace with us, and your grit. And your work in our community is so important. So thank you for opening your hearts to us and sharing that with us. It does make me hopeful that working together, we can start to make some changes, important changes in our system. We're going to close it out, but I do want to just say we know very clearly that all people deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. And what makes me hopeful about the work that so many people in our community do is that it reminds us how important it is to keep that energy going, right? It's like a lamp. It's like an electric lamp. As long as there's energy flowing, the light stays on. But as soon as it shuts off, the light goes out. So we need all of you to remember that that energy has to stay in our community. We need people to advocate and lobby and talk to your friends and talk to your family. That's the only way we're going to make these changes. We have to eliminate barriers to well-being in our city. And we have to actively protect our neighbors, especially those whose intersectionality makes them targets, or worse, erases their experience altogether. So as we leave tonight, the Seattle Human Rights Commission calls on each of you to be vocal. We want to call out practices that you see as discriminatory. Go visit your elected officials and ask them what they're doing to actively protect human rights in the city. Be a champion for our panelists and for their constituencies. We have to remember that human rights are not granted to us, and therefore our government can't take them away, but we probably will have to continue to fight for them. We need your constant energy to light the way for our leaders and for justice for our community. So thank you for being here tonight. Please go forth and make sure that our human rights are protected in this city. Thank you very much.